This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the course of the hour, we'll run through the business news stories you need to know about from the continent and beyond. Quite a bit to get through, but let's first start with a run through the markets for you. Now, you do see quite a bit of red ink across the board today, but that being said, limited changes on the JSE, especially on the top 40 today. Nonetheless, it's up at least 2% so far this week. The EGX 30 following a broadly similar trend, up about 1.3% so far in the week. The Nasdaq essentially heading in the complete opposite direction, down by about 0.4% at 1754 GMT, but it's also down about 0.7% so far this week. With regard to East Africa, there's an interesting change in sentiment with regard to the biggest single listed firm on the Kenyan market, Safaricom. All of the buy recommendations on it are completely gone. The majority now holds. The question is, why has that sentiment changed? In one word, quite a bit of the market thinks it's entirely overvalued. Here's what's coming up tonight. Shell agrees to pay over $100 million in compensation to Nigeria's Ogoni people after a decade-long court tussle. Tanzania's foreign direct investments make a historic rise. And we'll explore how hackers got away with over $600 million in cryptocurrency. All that and more is coming up tonight. But we start the hour tonight in Nigeria. The multinational national oil firm Shell Petroleum has agreed to pay nearly $112 million to the Ogoni people of Rivers State in Nigeria for losses incurred due to oil spillages that ravaged the lands the community lived and relied on to make a living. Now remember, this comes 10 years after a federal high court ordered the company to pay that compensation. The cash will be paid to the Ogonis through their lawyer, Chief Lucius Nwosu. Now, Shell's lawyers had sought to pay through the chief registrar of the court. Since 1976, over 2 million barrels of oil have polluted Ogoni land in thousands of different oil spills. Pipelines operated by Shell subsidiary there still traverse the land, the creeks and the waterways in that part of Nigeria even today. Let's bring you up to speed with developments in this case in Nigeria, one of many around the business of oil spills in the country. Deji Badmus joins us now live from Lagos. Deji, at the current dollar-naira rate, this works out to just under $112 million. Now, for a company that pocketed around net earnings of $5.5 billion in the second quarter of 2021 alone, that figure looks extremely low. How was this number arrived at as the net compensation for the community?
Well, first thing to say, Ramah, is that this case actually dates back to 1991. So this case has actually lasted in court for like 31 years, so you can imagine. Now, how was the figure arrived at? Of course, you're quite right, it's small, but when the Federal High Court actually gave that judgment back in 2010, what the Federal High Court asked Shell to pay in damages was 17 billion naira. That's around $41 million now. And then the court also approved, ordered Shell to pay 25% on the principal sum, so 25% on the $41 million over the period that the case had lasted, that the pollution had lasted. Eventually, of course, as you know, Shell had to appeal and all of that. So, and then according to the lawyer of these Ogoni people now, according to him, at the time the Federal High Court gave that judgment, what Shell was supposed to have paid them was $442 million, something around 182 billion naira now. But eventually, I think what happened here is that when Shell eventually, because had ruled against Shell, and Shell eventually decided to pay, Shell had to negotiate with the Ogoni people and the lawyers, and that's how they came by that figure for around $112 million. Ramah?
Indeed. So anyone who's watching this conversation, as you pointed out, this case has been running for the better part of 3 decades. Why did it take so long for us to get to this resolution? Why did it take so long for the Ogoni people to get justice?
Now, Rama, what you're asking is, if we were to discuss that, we would need about 3 days to discuss the issue of justice delivery in the country. The process of justice delivery in this country is quite slow. And, you know, this case went from the High Court to the Supreme Court. So, you know, when Shell lost the case at the High Court, it decided to appeal and ask for a stay of execution. It got to the appeal stage, it lost the case, and then went to the Supreme Court. It lost the case eventually in 2019. As a matter of fact, the Supreme Court gave a judgment on this case in 2019. And then sometime in 2020, the Supreme Court again to review its own judgment. And of course, the Supreme Court threw out the case, and that is what has led to this settlement. But the truth is that, look, the process of justice in this country grinds very, very slowly. Everyone knows about that. There are several problems that we cannot talk about here. And it's the reason, Rama, that you find a lot of people from the Niger Delta region who have cases against Shell and some other international oil companies operating in that region. You find a lot of them heading abroad to prosecute their cases. You remember there's a case in the United Kingdom now. You remember the case involving Shell again and a Netherlands court. So it's because these people feel they are not able to get justice, not just justice, but even get speedy justice. That's the reason why they're all heading abroad to seek justice. It's quite sad. But then this is an encouragement for people, those who may have cases now against some of these international oil companies, to pursue their cases here, because they know, I mean, with what has happened now, that eventually they might get justice, but it just might take a long time. 31 years is such a long, long time, Rama.
Indeed, it's some would argue it's essentially injustice squared. But let's pick up on something that you actually did mention in your response there. Shell's also facing another lawsuit in the UK. Over 42,000 farmers and fishermen got the leeway to sue the company for damage caused by years of oil spills. I believe that was earlier this year in February. Do we have any more progress on that case?
Now, that case is clearly an example of these individuals had to go to the UK court because they felt they would not get justice here, and that justice would be delayed. For now, at the moment, there's nothing new on that case. Of course, as you know, what the UK Supreme Court ruled on was that these people are free. I mean, cases can actually be brought against Shell in the courts in the United Kingdom. So we're waiting for their lawyers now to file the case. But what I understand is going on now is that talks are going on. Shell is trying to negotiate with the people to see how this case can be resolved out of court. I guess that's the reason why we're not hearing much yet. But I think with the recent with the recent development, I mean, Shell accepting to pay this huge amount of money now to people of Goni, then we're likely, it's very likely we would hear something about that case now, probably in the coming weeks or days. We just have to wait and see. But then nothing yet on that case, as I know it.
Indeed. Thank you for bringing us up to speed on that particular case. Tej Badmusir live in Lagos. Now, from West Africa, let's head over to North Africa. The Executive Board of Tunisia's central bank is calling for drastic economic reforms to help the country overcome its current multiple crises. As CGTN's Adin Chouachina reports, the North African country has been struggling with a crippling economic crisis, and that includes sky-high inflation, high unemployment, and a surge in COVID-19 infections.
The Central Bank of Tunisia urged the government, as well as all political and social actors in the country, to preserve political stability and spur its economic recovery. Experts maintain that several years of political turmoil and social unrest have slowed down economic reforms and growth in the North African state.
The central bank says that there are too many economic objectives and much-needed reforms, but which have been hampered by obstacles created by political parties, national organizations, and the Tunisian society in general. Some officials who have benefited from this crisis over the last decade want this situation to remain unchanged, the state to remain weak, and its institutions to be absent, so that they can continue to profit at the expense of the national economy.
The Apex Bank also called for the need to restore the confidence of international banking and financial institutions and foreign donors in the Tunisian economy.
The problem in Tunisia is that there's a crisis within the crisis management unit. The president, the parliament speaker and the prime minister could not agree on one economic strategy for the state. At the same time, the IMF, the World Bank and all international donors need one Tunisian interlocutor and one voice, with a clear vision for the economic woes and its solutions.
President Kais Saied sacked Tunisia's finance minister and appointed Siham Bourdiri as acting Minister of Finance, Economy and Investment in a bid to increase state revenues and accelerate the pace of structural economic reform. The new appointee is an expert in fiscal policy and reform.
Some Tunisians have hundreds of millions in foreign banks. We don't want any economic actor to be treated unjustly, but we are looking for fiscal justice for everyone. It's unacceptable that some people pay taxes while others don't. The individuals who tend to evade taxes in Europe are considered persona non grata by the state and the people.
According to the latest monetary and financial indicators published by the central bank, cumulative labor income increased by 32% at the end of July 2021. In addition, tourism revenues stood at $390 million at the end of July 2021, posting a 12% decrease compared to the same period last year. Analysts assert that the current political crisis remains alarming after the dismissal of the Prime Minister and his government by the Tunisian president. The absence of a clear roadmap has exacerbated the economic situation, which is battered by the COVID-19 pandemic. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
All right, and so where does that leave Tunisia? What are the options on the table for solving both the country's economic and political crises? Let's explore the options with Fadel Kiboub. He's an associate professor of economics at Denison University. He's joining us live on the program tonight. Thank you for your time this evening, sir. So cutting energy subsidies and lowering the public wage bill, which is equivalent to around 17% of GDP last year, according to the IMF. These are key priorities for the country, but why is it so difficult to do this?
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks for the question. It's difficult because these are social priorities. There's mass unemployment in Tunisia, there's inflation, there's a massive external debt, and all of these things are interlinked. So reducing the wage bill in and of itself, reducing the subsidies for food and fuel in of themselves will not address the root causes of this problem, which is the external debt. And when you look at Tunisia's external debt, its origins are fundamentally structural. They're related to food imports, they're related to energy imports, and they're related to a structural industrialization problem whereby Tunisia exports low value-added content and imports high value-added content. So you put these three things together and you end up with a structural trade deficit that weakens the value of the Tunisian dinar. And as a result, everything Tunisia imports the next day, whether it's food or medicine or fuel, is imported at a higher cost, which means we import that inflation. And the only way to mitigate the sources of inflation is not to cut the subsidies, but rather build productive capacity and food security and renewable energy security and a different kind of industrialization that focuses on value-added content. So all of these temporary solutions that are being debated currently with the IMF and within the Tunisian central bank, within the Tunisian government, are really band-aid solutions that are not going to address the fundamental root causes of this problem. And removing the subsidies is just going to make it even more painful for the most vulnerable people in Tunisia and not really address the roots of the problem.
But ultimately, I mean, at the end of the day, these subsidies can't go on forever, right? Because as you point out, the currency is being devalued, the productivity of the population as a whole, that's also not essentially rising at the pace that it needs to do. So at some point, we're essentially going to run off the cliff, and these subsidies will either have to be drastically reduced or cut entirely.
The subsidies should be shifted to building the productive capacities in the areas that will actually mitigate the source of inflation. That is renewable energy, that is food security, cracking down on corruption, cracking down on smuggling, cracking down on abusive price-setting behavior, cracking down on the individuals and companies that have exclusive import licenses that actually control these markets. This is where the roots of the problems are. And some of this is happening in the last few days on a small scale, but this has to be a systematic kind of long-term strategic vision focusing on the roots of the problem. I'll give you one example. And this is true for other central banks around the world, not just Tunisia. When we face inflation, central banks raise interest rates and try to slow down economic activity, essentially, by raising interest rates. When the actual source of inflation, say in a country like Tunisia, is wheat imports and fuel imports. So what does raising the interest rate in Tunisia, what is it going to do to convince OPEC to lower fuel prices, or to convince the Ukraine or Russia or Australia to lower wheat prices? These are prices that are determined in global markets way outside the jurisdiction of the central bank. And as a result, these tools that central bankers use are really not addressing the roots of the problem. They're just trying to kind of introduce band-aids and wiggle around the edges without really addressing anything structural.
The UGTT Labour Union has called for the speedy appointment of a small cabinet led by an experienced premier. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that does happen. What are the top 3 or 5 things that they must solve this year?
Absolutely. So the top 3 issues that any administration must address, and the 10 administrations that took office in the last 10 years since the uprisings of 2011 should have addressed, are the following. Prioritizing food security, that is, investing in domestic food sovereignty. Number 2, prioritizing renewable energy production. And that is, you can't really run an economy without food, without energy. These are the foundations of the economy. Number 3, cracking down on corruption networks that have this abusive market share, that have this abusive price-setting behavior, cross-border trafficking networks. And then finally, having a long-term strategic vision for Tunisia's industrial policy. That is, moving away from the race to the bottom, whereby we focus on any kind of assembly line type of manufacturing, any kind of foreign direct investment, and rather prioritizing high value added content of industrialization, focusing on strategic areas of resilience, such as health and education and infrastructure. These has to be the top priority of any administration, regardless of their political affiliation, because this is how you build a resilient and sustainable economy.
All right, one last question for you, sir. So where does this leave Tunisia's talks on a new program with the IMF? If there is no deal with the IMF, might we perhaps see Tunisia go down the same route that Lebanon has gone down?
Well, unfortunately, I've said this before, and I repeat it again today. This is really the result of decades of austerity, of decades of neglect in investing in key areas of resilience for the economy. And if we rely on external funds, external loans from the IMF and other international lenders, then you're going to have to accept their conditions. And their conditionalities are extremely painful. And the thing is, if they were painful and they would work, we'll say, okay, this is a necessary pain. The problem is that these are painful and dangerous, and they don't even work in the short term or in the long term. These are simply Band-Aid solutions. The infection is still there. You can't fix it with a Band-Aid. You can't fix it with a short-term loan from the IMF.
All right, we'll leave it there for the time being. Fadel Kaboub, Associate Professor of Economics at Denison University. Thank you very much for your time this evening. Now let's head over to South Africa. Earlier on Wednesday, the country's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, told the State Capture Commission headed by Justice Raymond Zondo, that he chose not to resign as deputy president during former President Jacob Zuma's time in office, as this would essentially only have earned him praise in the public arena, but it would not have enabled him to end state capture. In his testimony before the country's long-running corruption inquiry, Mr. Ramaphosa told the commission that he was unaware that the South African government had been captured. CGTN's Yolisa Njamela was there.
As the State Capture Commission wraps up its 3-year-long work, Ramaphosa returned one last time to answer questions in his capacity as the state president. The commission is investigating deep-rooted corruption in the state during former President Jacob Zuma's tenure. Ramaphosa was Zuma's deputy at the time. At the center of the corruption accusations are allegations that former President Jacob Zuma was influenced by the Guptas, a wealthy South African family, to loot state funds. Ramaphosa has faced criticism that he was Zuma's deputy when the Gupta family was accused of looting the state, allegedly enabled by Zuma. He says he had no knowledge of the state capture.
Many of the incidents of corruption that would in time be described as state capture became known to me as they did to the general public through the work of journalists, civil society organizations, and institutions such as the Public Protector and Auditor General. Reports of court cases and disciplinary proceedings, together with the commendable work of investigative journalists and whistleblowers, did help to give insight into corruption in both government and in the private sector.
The president says upon finding out, he had a couple of options. Those included speaking out and or resigning.
While I would have earned quite a lot of praise from many quarters, this action of resignation would have significantly impaired my ability to contribute to bring about what I would call an end to state capture. It would have caught the big headlines, newspapers, and that would have been the end of it. Had I and like-minded individuals resigned from the executive, we would have had no ability to resist some of the excesses that were taking place.
The president also explained how he pushed back on the appointment of Des van Rooyen as finance minister in December 2015. Former President Jacob Zuma had fired the then finance minister, Nhlanhla Nene. The appointment of van Rooyen, which only lasted a weekend, caused an immediate and dramatic fall of the rand.
To me, the capture of National Treasury was almost the final culmination of state capture, because you capture National Treasury, then you have basically captured the entire state, because that is where the money is, that is where it is controlled.
Ramaphosa will conclude his appearance at the commission on Thursday. Yolisa Njamela for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Let's start in East Africa. In our company news wrap, ABSA's Kenyan subsidiary has rolled out a banking service on WhatsApp. The new product is aimed at making it a lot easier for customers to carry out transactions through a chatbot on that particular application. So through that facility, ABSA customers will now be able to effect mobile transactions, inter-account transfers, bill payments, and of course, make balance inquiries too. ABSA is committed to investing at least $14 million this year on digitizing a lot of its services. Swvl, spelled as SWVL, the Egyptian ride-sharing startup listed on the Nasdaq, is looking to increase its market value up to $15 billion. That's up from $1.5 billion at present. Founded back in 2017, Swvl started as a bus-hailing service in Egypt. It since then expanded to Kenya and Pakistan, and now it intends to purchase a ride-sharing enterprise in Europe. The retailer Steinhoff has increased the amount it's willing to pay out to investors who lost out in its share price plunge by about $217 million in a bid to win more votes. The retailer's total settlement offer now stands at about $1.7 billion. Steinhoff says one of the largest investor groups that was opposed to its initial offer has now accepted the new proposal in principle. And finally, Google employees in the US who opt to work from home permanently may get a pay cut. The tech giant has developed a calculator that lets its employees see what the impact would be on their earnings depending on where they choose to work and whether they choose to work from home or in an office. Google says it has no plans at this time to implement that policy in the United Kingdom. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's on the other side. Tanzania's foreign direct investments remained steady in 2020. We'll explore why. And mobile money is altering the way of doing business in Ghana. That story's coming up shortly.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business. Only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible? And why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sumitra Naidu. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business. Welcome back to the program. You're watching Global Business Africa. Now, despite the adverse impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the economy, Tanzania's foreign direct investment levels apparently did reach the $1 billion mark in 2020. That is the highest level in at least 5 years. That's according to data from the World Investment Report 2021. It's published every year by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. The country saw at least $1.01 billion of FDI flowing into the country in 2020. That's higher than the $991 million recorded the year before. Now, the last time the country reported over $1 billion in FDI flows was back in 2015. The figure then was $1.6 billion. After that, however, they fell by nearly half to $864 million in 2016. In 2017 and 2018, the country saw around $938 and $980 million in FDI coming into the year every year. Year on year, Tanzania was reported to be the country that led with the highest increase of FDI flows in the East African region. Other countries suffered adversely from pandemic-related issues. All right then, so that data does look interesting, but let's dig a little deeper into it, shall we? Let's explore the data coming out of Tanzania with Constantine Manda. He's the inaugural director of the Impact Evaluation Lab at Tanzania's Economic and Social Research Foundation, and he joins us on the program right now. Thank you for your time this evening. So FDI flows in Tanzania, relatively speaking, they're quite stable in 2020 despite the pandemic. But where was this money going? What were people investing in?
So it's not clear, given that we don't have all access to the data. You know, the central bank, the Bank of Tanzania, hasn't yet released the kind of latest details on where some of this foreign direct investment may be. But there are two possible sectors of the economy where we can speculate where they could be going. So the first is infrastructure. As you know, President Magufuli's administration from 2015 to 2020 really focused on infrastructural development. So the bus rapid transit system, roads, electrification, and several other infrastructural projects. The second area where this could possibly be going to is tourism. We've seen recently an influx of tourism within the last 12 months, in particularly of 2020, from countries that traditionally weren't the biggest givers of tourists to Tanzania, including, for example, countries like Russia, which we have been seeing. And there are stories and anecdotes that you hear in Zanzibar and elsewhere in Tanzania of investors also coming in from the African diaspora in the United States, for example. So African-American investors are also coming in to start to get some of the investment in tourism industry as well.
So from 2016 onwards, FDI flows in Tanzania fell significantly. In fact, on a year-on-year basis, 2016-2015, they fell by almost half compared to the $1.6 billion in FDI in 2015. Was this a direct result of the policies that were being pursued at the time by the country's president, John Magufuli?
It is possible, perhaps, that it is due to the Magufuli administration, and in particular, the President John Joseph Magufuli, the late president of Tanzania, But there are two kind of important caveats to consider when thinking about whether we can attribute the decline to the Magufuli administration or to other factors. I think the first is to notice that as a percentage of GDP, FDI has actually been declining since 2013. I mean, it's been fluctuating up and down before then, but the downward trend really began before the Magufuli administration came to power in 2015. And so if you think of it as a matter of, as the economy is growing, Tanzania has recently in 2019 become a middle income country according to the World Bank classification of income across countries. And so, as a percentage of GDP, there isn't necessarily anything special about the Magufuli administration. I think the second caveat to think about is the composition of investors that are coming in with this FDI, right? So the traditional kind of investors from the West aren't necessarily going to be the same ones that came in with the Magufuli administration, given the kind of pivot away from kind of human capital investments directly, but investing in hard infrastructure, in roads, and in building, and having desks coming into the classrooms, electricity to rural areas. And so we're seeing, investors from Turkey, from China, from Kenya, and other African countries coming in. And so the composition of the investor pool, I think, is also something that we would need to unpack once we start to get some of the figures, particularly between the first administration of the Magufuli administration and the current President Samia administration. The other thing to also consider, obviously, is also that since President Samia has come to power, she's made remarks that are very pro-investment. So one of the issues that have been raised by investors in the past is that it's very difficult to hire and fire workers, especially if you're trying to hire foreign workers. And so President Samia has gone out and explicitly said that kind of demeanor of being anti-international staff is going to change in her administration. And so that, I think, is also going to be good news for investors.
Okay, we'll leave it there for the time being. Should be interesting to pass that data a little later on once we do get our hands on it. Constantine Manda, thank you very much. Now, on to West Africa, Ghana to be specific. An innovation created some 12 years ago has completely changed the way people do business over the last decade. Mobile money has revolutionized the way people transfer and receive money all on their mobile phones. And they say financial tech could further accelerate the growth in mobile money services right across the country and reap dividends in financial inclusion. CGTN's Nabil Ahmed Rufai reports from Accra.
Owen Obodai does not worry when people want to buy an appliance from his shop and do not have cash. He has signed up for a mobile money system which allows customers to make payments by transferring money from their mobile phone onto his.
When people use mobile money to pay, it makes it easier for me. I don't need to hold cash around.
Mobile money transaction was introduced in Ghana in 2009. It took a couple of years to be accepted in the country due to lack of regulation by Ghana Central Bank. Now, nearly 15 million people are registered with the service, which has made it more convenient to deposit and transfer money, unlike going to the bank.
The point of inflection happened at the point where the guidelines and the regulations came in. And I think another good thing also that happened was that Bank of Ghana, the regulator, was very collaborative in, coming up with the guidelines and coming up with the regulations to the point when the Payment Systems and Services Act was passed in 2015.
3 telecommunications networks operate mobile money services in Ghana. MTN has the largest share of subscribers of nearly 10 million. Ghana Central Bank says mobile money transactions have hit nearly $80 billion in the first half of this year. The uptake in transactions is linked to the introduction of a platform that allows people to transfer money from one mobile money account to another across all telecommunications networks. Other platforms have also been created by fintechs, which allow people living abroad to send remittances to their relatives in Ghana through their mobile money accounts. Analysts say more innovations are needed to boost mobile money services in Ghana.
I believe that the future for mobile money is very bright. What we need to happen is that government needs to allow the space for it to be able to flourish, whilst it provides the regulatory framework that guides it so that we are protecting the consumer, but allowing innovation to take place.
Owen Obodai agrees. While mobile money services have improved financial inclusion in Ghana, he warns telecommunications companies to enhance their systems to speed up the rate of transactions. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, CGTN, Accra, Ghana.
On to South Africa now. The Shiamiso Trust, it's a legal mechanism created in the country to deal with compensation claims against 6 owners of gold mines who owned H2 mines around the country, to deal with miners who contracted silicosis while working in those mines. The trust has made the first 100 payments to compensation claimants, totaling about $620,000 US. Here's Angela Coppola with that story.
Individual payments range between $1,700 and $17,000 for qualifying miners who worked on any of those 82 mines between 1965 and 2019.
And the miners had to do risk work for a period of time. So even though there's a big population, in order to meet all of those distinct criteria, the number who are going to ultimately be compensated is not known actually at this point. The figure of 39,600 that we quoted, those were just the number of lodgements as at the end of July.
One of the major concerns is fraud, and systems have been put in place to manage that risk.
The mining companies are extremely concerned about that, and there are fairly stringent measures in place that allow the companies to scrutinize very closely whatever is submitted, whether it's medical information or work records, or even information about the jobs that the people did and where they were employed. So one of the purposes of building this rather large and potentially cumbersome system was to deal with that concern.
The Trust is looking for possible claimants in South Africa and in neighbouring countries, with some success.
We have close on 18,000 lodgements already done in Lesotho. We have about 2,500 done in Mozambique. We're growing our numbers in Swaziland.
Even Malawi, there are many former mine workers in Malawi who qualify for benefits and who need to be identified and brought forward. Mozambique is huge. I mean, perhaps 30% of all old mine workers are Mozambicans. They're in southern Mozambique, but they need to be reached. They need to be brought into the network.
Spoor suggests that there may be between 100,000 and 200,000 claims that could be presented to the Trust in the next decade.
The Trust has a positive obligation to find mine workers and compensate them. So it's not a passive trust who sits back and says, well, come forward, make your claim. It has a duty to get out there, to reach out to people and ensure they come through.
This settlement covers 2/3 of the registered mines that operated here during the time, and there are plans now to drag the 3 remaining mines that disputed the class action case into the fold via the High Court. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Over a decade of armed conflict has left more than 2 million people displaced in northeastern Nigeria. And this makes it one of the world's most complex humanitarian emergencies. Now, the loss of livelihoods there left many struggling to meet day-to-day essential needs. But then you add in a pandemic, sky-high inflation that's just been rising year after year, and the IDP community has an enormous crisis on their hands. CGTN's Alexander Majala has that story.
Millions of Nigerians who fled their homes due to an ongoing insurgency in the country's northeast are now struggling to meet their basic needs due to soaring inflation. According to the National Bureau of Statistics, Nigeria's inflation rate reached a 4-year record high of 18% in March this year. Prices of food staples like eggs, onions and palm oil have risen by at least 30% in Africa's largest economy. Aisha Umar, a widowed mother from Borno State, has been living with her 8 children in the Bakassi camp in Maiduguri for the last 7 years.
Nowadays, if I buy rams at $75 or $100, I can sell them at $145 or $170. I deduct the cost of fodder and I use the rest to pay for school. I avoid spending the capital. I buy smaller animals to keep the business going. It helps me keep the children in school. I don't have any relatives and no one has ever given me anything, even an Ankara piece of fabric. My younger brother was helping me, but he is no longer with us.
The international community of the Red Cross provides microeconomic grants to help Umar and others start small businesses. But the steep inflation of the past year is making it hard for them to keep their businesses afloat.
Previously, the price of the product was acceptable. Since it has increased, we have to buy it at an expensive rate. And since we sell it in the camp, we know they are IDPs. The price cannot be the same since we take their situation into consideration.
According to statistics, 40% of Nigeria's population, or almost 83 million people, live below the country's poverty line of $382 per year. Rising unemployment and political insecurity in farming regions in the north are threatening to plunge more of the nation's formerly middle class into financial despair. The World Bank estimates that the drastic price changes in 2020 pushed 7 million more Nigerians into poverty, an increase of nearly 10%. Alexandria Majala for CGTN.
You're watching Global Business Africa. Here's what's coming up next. Hackers have made away with $600 million worth of cryptocurrency. We'll explore efforts to get it back. And green investments are powering China's run to its carbon goals. The details coming up shortly.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what do you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back to the program. Let's run through some of the stories making you headlines at this hour. Starting in Ethiopia, the country's National Defense Force say they are recapturing towns recently taken by the TPLF. The Ethiopian army is reportedly staging a strong offensive against the rebels after the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government announced the lifting of a unilateral ceasefire, which the TPLF declined to observe. Still in that same region, Sudan says it's ready to hand over former government officials to the International Criminal Court. The former leaders are being accused of being behind human rights violations during the civil war in Darfur. They include the former deposed president, Omar Hassan al-Bashir, as well as Ahmed Haroun and Abdel Rahim Mohammed Hussein, who both served as security and defense ministers during that civil war. Hussein and Haroun have been under arrest in Khartoum. And finally, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa told the State Capture Commission that he chose not to resign as deputy president during former President Jacob Zuma's time in office, as that, in his view, would have only earned him praise, but it would not have enabled him to end state capture. In his testimony before the country's long-running corruption inquiry, Mr. Ramaphosa told the commission that he was unaware that the South African government had been captured. That's a run through your headlines. Right then, on to the world of cryptocurrencies. Hackers have started returning, apparently, some of the over $600 million they stole in what is likely to be one of the largest cryptocurrency heists ever. The cybercriminals exploited a vulnerability in Poly Network. It's a platform that looks to connect different blockchains so that they can work together. Poly Network disclosed this attack on the 10th of August, and it asked to establish communication with the hackers. It actually put out a public letter to that effect, urging them to return the hacked, essentially stolen assets. This latest attack comes as losses from theft, hacks, fraud related to decentralized finance hit an all-time high, raising the risk of both investing in the sector, but also of regulators looking to take a much closer look at what's going on there. For many Chinese companies, efforts towards a green transition or the low carbon and sustainable development business often fraught with financing challenges. But that might be a thing of the past soon, as Chinese lenders increasingly try to bridge the gap with green finance. Zhang Xishuan takes a closer look.
China's move to achieve net zero emissions by 2060 has created a new hot term in the banking world: green finance. The People's Bank of China defines that as financial services that support environmental improvement, tackle climate change, and effectively use and conserve resources. Green finance is turning up in project investment, operations, and risk management, and banks in China are actively responding to new demands from both investors and issuers based on increased awareness of environmental, social, and governmental issues.
There's no specific definition for the ESG product to have a specific cut of the cost or the interest rate, etc. But because you have more investors interested in these instruments, so naturally there's a demand-supply play. There's more demand, and you have only limited supply of green instruments. Naturally, the interest cost would be lower.
During the first half of this year, the bank raised more than $26.5 billion for Asia-Pacific clients in support of their sustainable financing needs, more than quadruple last year's figure. Chinese companies accounted for 32% of that.
There's more and more pressure from investor side. More investors, they want to invest more in ESG debt instruments. And for most of the PE funds, hedge funds, they also set target for them to hold a certain percentage of ESG in their portfolio. So that has come to a bigger component or trend for China corporate, especially for their overseas financing.
The bank conducted a survey of almost 260 institutional clients in 14 markets across the Asia-Pacific in the first quarter, showing that 54% of the respondents already have ESG policies and practices integrated in their organization's corporate strategy. Citibank is far from alone with its ESG policies. China Development Bank now has a green loan balance of over 2.3 trillion yuan, the largest among China's domestic banks. At the end of June, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China's green loan balance exceeded 2 trillion yuan. China leads the world in terms of green loan and green bond market. As of the end of last year, green loans in China totaled $1.8 trillion, and the total of green bonds came to $125 billion. So in such a large market, what's going to drive new growth?
It is estimated that in the next decade, traditional coal power industry will have a higher default risk, rising from just 3% to more than 20%. But green technology innovation is in line with overall industrial trends, which will help banks increase their loan issuance while meeting ESG requirements and guaranteeing good economic returns.
Support from the central bank is on the way. The PBOC says regulators are working on streamlining green finance standards, bringing them close to international practice and enhancing information disclosure. These measures will make it easier for international investors to access the country's green finance market, and so to join in it too. Zhang Shixuan, ICS for CGTN, Shanghai.
Repeated lockdowns and travel restrictions have caused enormous disruptions to businesses around the world. But for fintech companies in the United Arab Emirates, it's been a bit of a boon, actually, due to rapid changes in consumer spending. Jacob Greaves looks at how a region where cash used to be king is now going cashless at an enormous pace.
Launching a startup during a global pandemic might not be a recipe for success, but for a Dubai-based fintech company, it's proved to be good timing. Spotty is a buy now, pay later platform offering customers delayed payments on purchases. It's a relatively new concept for the UAE that went live last April.
What we could see was that the macro shifts that were attractive about this particular product just were accelerating in the pandemic. People were in lockdown. People started moving online a lot faster than they had been historically.
Ziad and his team have since expanded into nearby Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Oman and Kuwait and been acquired by Australian fintech firm Zip for $20 million. Whilst fintech might be growing in the region, it comes from a relatively low base. A 2019 report by the Milken Institute estimated the MENA region accounted for around 1% of global fintech investment.
The infrastructure here set up was always supportive of these alternative forms of payment. So I think that it's just that the consumer is now catching up with the infrastructure as opposed to the other way around.
Whilst the pandemic might have been a catalyst for the adoption of cashless payments, here in the UAE and the broader region, there are other factors at play, namely young, tech-savvy populations increasingly embracing online and mobile payments and governments incentivising e-commerce. A recent survey by Visa found that 66% of consumers polled in the UAE expected digital payment options from merchants. That's up from just 18% pre-pandemic. But this trend isn't without its risks for consumers. A study involving Dubai police found 4 in 10 UAE consumers were targeted for online fraud in 2020, whilst any increased digitisation raises potential privacy and data breach concerns.
So global average from a contactless perspective, people using a touchless payment method at the point of sale is circa 50%, and that's after the higher adoption that's been driven by the pandemic. In the UAE, we see that as nearly 2/3 of all transactions, right? So it's sort of setting the pace. In Saudi, that number is close to 80%. So it's a significant lead over, so you could count UAE and Saudi in the top 10, top 15 countries globally.
Yes. It's a trend that's seeing traditional brick and mortar banks adapt. Abu Dhabi Islamic Bank is one such lender trying to tap into changing consumer habits, recently launching this, the UAE's first bank account that can be opened online using facial recognition technology, part of a bid to compete in a rapidly growing e-commerce sphere.
We've seen a rise in e-commerce during 2020 to $3.9 billion. The UAE e-commerce market was $3.9 billion in 2020, and that's 53% higher than it was in 2019.
One legacy of the pandemic in the UAE and broader Gulf will likely be bringing fintech to the fore. Jacob Greaves, CGTN in Dubai.
Now, when it comes to food, the colours that tend to come to mind more often than not would be green, lots of veggies, red, plenty of meat, yellow, some fruits, but not exactly blue. Blue is not usually the first thing that comes to mind, but blue-coloured food products apparently are making waves among young consumers in China. Blue cakes, blue burgers, and a host of other unique items are apparently a new summer favourite as people try to find new food products that are both healthy and appealing. Yu Bo-kun explores the reasons behind this new craze.
Blue is often colored to avoid for foodies, as it's considered an appetizer present in the food spectrum. It is also rarely seen in the natural product and never used for food products. There are other reasons also to avoid blue, black, or purple food, as they're often associated with poison or things that are harmful to health. But some entrepreneurs are out to disprove the old adage by launching blue-colored food for consumers. Kuang Yao Rose is one of them, who has introduced blue hamburgers for consumers.
We launched the Blue Burger a year after I opened my store. I was obsessed with the 1980s animation character Doraemon. I wanted to make a product that captured my love for the blue-colored Doraemon and also appealed to the younger generation. Thus was the Blue Burger born. We did not have too much of hopes initially, as we were afraid that consumers may consider our burger as something weird.
But as it turns out, the Blue Burger has been a resounding success.
I usually come here with friends just for this burger because we all like Doraemon.
I think young consumers want new and special products. For them, food is not only about appearances, but also about quality.
Color psychology is something that companies have been using extensively in marketing campaigns for a long time. Data shows that nearly 85% of the consumers cite color as the single reason for the choice of a particular goods. To cite examples, red and yellow are the most used colors for fast food items. That is because red triggers stimulation, appetite, and hunger, while yellow brings the feelings of happiness and friendliness. Green is also a popular color in the catering sector. It's usually used for organic and healthy food. However, blue was never the market darling, so why did some company introduce them?
So it really gives people a sense of exoticness, something that is very interesting, something is very unique, and also, very inspiring as well. But again, I guess in a specific season like summer, and also with a specific group of consumers, especially the younger consumer like Gen Z, they do want something unique. I guess now consumers' tastes are getting increasingly diversified, and blue color can be a choice for certain group of consumers.
In the meantime, consumers' desire to try novel goods and their growing health awareness are also driving the demand for natural colors compared to synthetic colors. Data shows that natural food color market is set to grow at a compound annual growth rate of 8.4% from 2019 to 2027 and reach $3.2 billion by 2027.
So I have to say that blue will be applied more and more to the food and beverage industry in that sense. But of course, I think the condition is that it will have to be safe, it will have to be healthy, and it really have to be sustainable. So I would say that the natural blue color or color extracted from natural ingredient will be more and more used in the future. So I think the companies that can provide a natural color ingredient will obviously excel in the future.
Experts believe that technological advancement will help the growth of natural food color market as more consumers look to improve their lifestyles. Yu Bokun, CGTN.
All right, then a quick run through the currencies for you. Quick update on inflation data from Egypt that came out yesterday, up to 5.4% in July. Fastest rise we've seen since December. The good news is, though, that it's essentially in the lower end of the band the CB is targeting. That band, of course, is between 5 to 9%, and it's expected to remain pretty much within that range over the short term. In East Africa, Kenya had its bond sale for August happening today. Some pretty interesting subscription numbers there, 174% as far as bids are concerned. The reopened 10-year note had an average market-weighted rate of around 12.3%, and the 20-year had an average rate of around 13.25% as well. That's a run through the currencies, and that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen on the program in the last hour. There are many ways to get your feedback back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.